In the spring of 1935, deep in the Charleston Municipal Archives, a clerk sorting through a stack of misplaced floodplain assessments came across something that should not have been there. A small unmarked envelope, no postage, no return address, no name, just a single word written in shaky graphite across the flap, hollow. Inside, there were 7 photographs. Grainy, unnumbered. Each captured the same cluster of cabins from slightly different angles. Cabins without chimneys, windows without glass, doors nailed shut from the inside. But hidden flat between the cardboard backing was an 8th image, one the archivist would later say kept him awake for weeks. It showed the forest floor beneath one of those houses split open like a wound. From the tear in the earth, something pale and rope-like reached upward. Fingers or roots pretending to be fingers. The house could not be identified. The location, Whitlock's Hollow, was worse. It appeared on no geological survey map, no county plat, no state property rolls, no federal census charts. Between 1900 and 1930, there was nothing. No births, no deaths, no graves. And yet, something lived there. Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Sleepy History Tales. Before we go any further into this particular darkness, indulge my curiosity. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? I always love seeing the map of our little night owl community fill the comments. Now, the object we begin with is not a relic in the usual sense. Not a weapon, not a diary, not even a tooth. It is a silence preserved deliberate. A blank space in the historical record where people were seen, but never counted. Children were photographed, but never named. Homes were built, boarded up, and never burned. When the land was later reclaimed, it resisted. Posts shifted, foundations cracked, buildings sank without a sound. And when investigators returned, they found no bones, only empty space, as if something had taken its leave without leaving a body behind. What follows is not a massacre, nor an epidemic, nor a haunting, at least not in the way those words are usually meant. This is the slow uncovering of a place meant to remain hidden, not because it was empty, but because what lived there was unfinished. And beneath it all, something waited. Quiet, remembering, still breathing. Welcome to Whitlock's Hollow. Winter, 1935. During a routine flood risk survey of the Congo River Basin, a federal team received an unremarkable parcel from the estate of a deceased Civil War collector in Charleston. Inside was a Confederate officer's coat, moth-eaten its cuffs, stiff with long-dried blood. Nothing in the shipment seemed noteworthy until a technician noticed the inner lining had been crudely restitched. Beneath 2 layers of faded cotton, hand-sewn into the breast pocket, lay a tightly folded parchment. Its edges crumbled at the touch. It was a map, drawn with almost no precision but with great intention. Rivers rendered in ash, trees marked with fingerprints, and in one corner, a single human figure stood in the marsh. No roads, no compass, no landmarks. Only 3 words in coal dust at the bottom, Whitlock's Hollow. The problem, as later memos noted, was simple. No such place existed. State archives showed no town, no farm, no tribal site within 10 miles of the coordinates. County plat maps from as early as 1824 agreed this stretch of land was empty. And yet, The spot matched perfectly with a stretch of floodplain surveyors had long dismissed as impossible mud without bottom compasses gone erratic. The decision to investigate did not come quickly. It was only after a young cartographer whose name never appeared in the final reports fell violently ill while handling the map that the order was given. Go into the woods. He was said to have whispered just before collapsing that he could hear breathing through the paper. His colleagues dismissed it as fever talk. When the team reached the site, there were no visible structures, only a tangle of pine and cypress so dense that even sunlight seemed to bend strangely between the branches. Compass needles trembled in place. The air hung heavy with the dull, sweet stench of fermenting algae and the deeper sourness of animal decay. And yet, barely 20 feet into the overgrowth, they found traces of habitation. A row of rusted nails in the shape of a doorframe, a collapsed fence, and most unsettling of all, a child's toy carved from gator bone sitting on a half-sunken stone step as though its owner might return at any moment. The anomalies multiplied. The terrain seemed to reset itself behind them. Trees they had marked were unmarked when they circled back. One man swore he heard his own voice echo before he spoke. Another walked in a tightening spiral for over an hour, teeth chattering, though the day was warm. And when they tried to leave, the youngest member, just 22, refused to move. The night before, he had sketched the original map in charcoal from memory. When compared side by side, the copy had changed. The name, Whitlock's Hollow, was gone. In its place, the words, "We are beneath." He never spoke again. No official discovery was recorded that week. The land was quietly reclassified as geologically unstable and culturally sensitive. The map was not returned to its box but locked away in a lead-lined drawer under a different name. For decades after, any field team assigned to that region of South Carolina was rotated out after no more than 3 days. And yet, somewhere in a forgotten drawer at the State Historical Archives in Columbia, the officer's coat still hangs, its lining resewn, as if it had never been touched. By the spring of 1935, 3 weeks after the first map was found, a secondary team was dispatched. Their mission was simple: determine if Whitlock's Hollow had ever been accessible by any known route. They began with elevation charts, erosion studies, and soil analysis. What they uncovered was not a path, but an absence. No traces of roads, no footpaths, no car tracks, no animal trails. Tree ring studies showed the forest had stood untouched since at least 1870. No chopping, no clearing, no bending toward any light that might suggest a way through. It was as though the woods had been planted with the deliberate intent to keep something in. In nearby counties, records were vague. When pressed, elders from the closest settlements, Fairhope and Pinebridge, spoke in fragments. They'd heard from their grandparents that something old once lay beyond the marsh. But the grandparents had been told not to ask. The phrase "tree-bound twins" surfaced in multiple interviews, always said with a forced laugh, the kind that dies before it reaches the eyes. One man remembered being told the children out there had faces too alike to count and would move in eerie unison when startled. Another spoke of a barefoot woman who emerged from the thicket one summer in 1909, dragging a sack of hair. He swore her eyes looked borrowed. No postal service had ever charted a route through the place. No telegraph lines, no attempt during the Rural Expansion Acts of 1912. Merchants simply skipped it, Surveyors later noted that within a 2-mile radius, magnetic compasses spun wildly, pausing only to point toward a small glade almost exactly at the hollow's center. Those tasked with aerial reconstruction did not fare much better. And speaking of direction, my friends, since we are navigating some unsettling ground, together humor my curiosity. If you had to drop a pin for where you are right now, where would it land? And is the sky outside your window dark? Or not quite yet? The earliest aerial photographs taken by biplane in 1926 showed little more than a thick, unbroken canopy, broken only by scattered clearings, none larger than a parlor. One clearing stood out a perfect square, bordered on each corner by 4 pines of identical height. It seemed too precise to be natural. And yet, no structure could be confirmed beneath the foliage. Later frames revealed faint flashes of light beneath the trees, symmetrical points of metallic reflection. When enhanced, the glints resolved into glass window panes perhaps, but there was still no visible building shape. Whatever stood beneath had been made not to rise into view, but to remain hidden. Few travelers ever came close. One migrating family in 1883 reported seeing children in the woods, barefoot, pale, unmoving, watching silently from between the pine trunks. When the father approached, none ran. Instead, they tilted their heads in unison and blinked at staggered, unnatural intervals. No sound. The family cut their journey short by 3 days. The absence of roads still troubles researchers, yet artifacts, tools, cloth flour sacks stamped with shipment dates were later recovered. Trade had occurred, but without paths, without tracks. Whatever was brought in came through brush that no outsider could pass without deliberate effort. One theory, whispered more than published, suggests that the settlement's children were trained to navigate the forest blindfolded, guided only by smell and sound. In 1913, a missing child turned up 3 counties away. Her palms were scarred with resin burns. Her ears were packed with hardened wax. She could not speak. In her hand was a length of bone carved into the shape of a key. Her origin was never traced. The nurse who wrote her intake report swore the girl's eyes did not match. From 1900 to 1930, 3 federal censuses passed, and not one recorded entry came from the land believed to hold Whitlock's Hollow. Surrounding counties were meticulously logged, parcel divisions, household heads, even livestock counts. But the hollow was a perfect corridor of silence carved straight through the bureaucratic record. Officials later blamed the terrain, claiming it made enumeration impossible. But internal routing maps from the time tell another story. In 1910, an inspector for a neighboring county described the eastern ridge as quiet pasture, noting a thin band of smoke rising from the woods each day. He circled it on his map, but did not cross the tree line. Researchers today are more unsettled by what's missing than by what's found. No claims, no deeds, no taxes, no inheritance transfers. For 3 generations, no one bought or sold or left the land. The only surviving civilian reference comes from a letter written in July 1899 by a traveling textile merchant whose route carried him across the inland Carolinas. He described an unplanned delay caused by a wood path that should not have been, which led to a clearing of 40 cabins. The cabins formed an inward-facing ring. No signs of trade, no firelight, only children, many of them standing unshod and watching. He wrote that they were the same in size, in eye, in chin, in color. And then came the line, that folklorists return to again and again. Two man-children with the same face. Shortly after writing the letter, the merchant fell ill. His handwriting deteriorated over the next 3 years. In 1902, he was committed to a private sanatorium in Savannah for what doctors then called cognitive frailty with optical recurrence. He died 3 years later. His records were destroyed in a fire. Census teams, for reasons never fully explained, were never ordered to enter the hollow. Whether that was policy or accident remains uncertain. But in 1920, a routing error sent 2 enumerators along a path less than half a mile east of the known perimeter. One claimed to glimpse a structure cut into the earth built downward, not upward. He was told later it was probably a root cellar. Perhaps it was. The other enumerator, the one who had not glimpsed the root cellar, left the bureau within the month. His resignation letter cited only a need for a quieter place to pray. No birth certificates, no marriage records, no death notices. Matched against school rosters, church rolls, physician ledgers. The result was identical, nothing. And yet, between 1905 and 1918, midwives working in 3 separate towns around the hollow began reporting the same recurring dream. In it, they were watched from beneath a wooden floor by children who never blinked. None of these women had ever met. All described the same face. When state geologists returned to Whitlock's Hollow in 1974, armed with modern equipment, subsurface scanners, aerial thermographs, archival overlays, they expected to find the usual remains of a small settlement graves. Stones, wooden markers, even faint indentations in the soil. They found none. The scans were absolute. No depressions, no mineral shifts from decomposition, no insect tunnels, no shallow burials, not even the bone nests that mark animal deaths in the wild. The problem wasn't that graves had been lost. It was that they had never been dug. For archivists who'd studied old local testimonies, this absence wasn't entirely unexpected. Whispers from the early 1900s hinted that the people of the hollow feared the soil itself. Stories varied. Some said the earth rejected the dead. Others claimed that what was buried returned not as spirit, but as something that needed to be fed. A sermon fragment recorded in 1906 by a regional clergyman still circulates in private collections. The boy who delivered it was no older than 12. He'd been found wandering the forest in a linen shift, hair matted with river silt. He spoke of souls pinned beneath beams and warned the congregation, never leave the body where the earth can reach it. The presiding bishop burned the account, but one copy survived hidden in a private ledger. The vegetation told its own story. Trees near the hollow's center grew in mirrored pairs. Some patches of ground remained perpetually bare. Moss was scarce. Birds avoided the canopy. No carrion insects appeared, and deer trails bent in wide arcs to avoid the interior. All signs of natural death were missing. The unease deepened when domestic artifacts were recovered from inside the cabins. Cloth bindings, strips of muslin, knotted with waxed thread. One still held human haircut rather than shed. They were arranged in circles beneath the floorboards alongside dried animal hides. None bore tooth marks or claw gouges. Some had grooves as if gnawed from the inside. In several cabins, floorboards had been crudely replaced with mismatched timber nails driven in at crooked angles. Beneath one was a narrow cavity filled with fine sifted ash. No charcoal, no fire residue, just ash, and what looked like part of a jawbone too small to belong to anything born. There were no burial records. Yet, death was not absent. A population must either reproduce or decline. This one had done both. But the rituals, the funeral, the stone, the ground had been bypassed entirely. One theory, spoken only behind closed doors, proposed that it was not burial at all, but keeping. If that were true, the question was never where the bodies had gone, but who was still sleeping above them. March 1935, a legislative push to update the state's hydrological maps sent a federal floodplain assessment team into the area once marked as Whitlock's Hollow. On paper, their work was routine, just a redrawing of elevation lines ahead of planned dam expansions. But internal memos suggest another motive. The official goal was flood prevention. The unofficial instruction buried in a supplementary directive was stranger. Note any aberrations in human settlement or land use. No explanation was given for the phrasing. The 5-man team departed Columbia under clear skies, armed with standard gear altimeters, soil augers, topographic guides. Since we're heading out with them into this next stretch of shadowed ground, let me turn the question to you. If you were one of the 5, would you be the one pushing forward or quietly looking for an excuse to turn back? The youngest member of the team carried a camera. Not a single photograph was ever developed. What we know comes instead from the handwritten notes of the lead hydrologist found inside his briefcase 3 days after the expedition ended without explanation. Their first encounter with Whitlock's Hollow was not something they saw, but something they smelled. Several hundred yards before the tree line, the air thickened, heavy, still metallic. The men described it as wet rust, layered with something organic, though none could name it outright. The scent clung to their tools, to their coats, and only deepened the further inland they moved. The silence struck them next. Not the hush of wilderness, but the manufactured stillness of a place that had decided to be quiet. No insects, no bird song, not even the groan of tree branches in the wind. One man tapped a pine trunk and waited for an echo. None came. The town itself emerged in fragments. First, a wooden sign, its paint long gone, buried under a drift of leaves. Then, cabins, each identical in size and shape, evenly spaced, everyone facing inward toward an empty square. No structure stood at its center. Windows shuttered from within. Doors bolted. Chimneys sealed over with clay and moss. They knocked on 12 doors. No answer. At one cabin, something pale shifted behind a slat. A child's face, maybe retreating into darkness. No one emerged. Inside those they managed to enter, the air turned from mildew to something sickly sweet. Meat softened and gelatinous. One home was thick with dust, and yet the bed bore the weight mark of recent sleeper. At its foot lay a folded wool blanket, speckled with fine white hairs. Beneath the bed, a wooden bowl sat upside down, its interior blackened as though scorched. The hydrologist noted a strange pattern. No single detail screamed wrongness, yet everything together did. The cabins felt inhabited, but utterly motionless, as if their residents had been told to stay still until the strangers left. On the second night, one man swore he heard footsteps pacing across the roof. Another woke to find his boots turned backwards beside his cot. A third clawed at his own forearms until they bled, mumbling that something was trying to climb out. By the morning of the fourth day, they called for emergency withdrawal. In the final lines of the hydrologist's notes, one phrase was circled twice in pencil. No signs of burial, no signs of decay, but something is not gone. When they left, every cabin door had been shut behind them. Not one creaked, not one groaned, as if they were used to opening and closing without human hands. That second full day was given over to surveying the settlement. 42 structures, all in a loose spiral formation, spaced with exacting precision. Each was built from the same unvarnished pine, pale, faintly swollen from humidity. Not a nail in sight, only wooden pegs. No expansions, no repairs. No personal marks, no child's carvings, no mismatched boards. It was as if each had been copied from a single shared memory. The ceilings pressed just above the head, uneven in slope, yet never leaking. No chimneys, no hearths. Most had no kitchen at all. Not a single window could be opened, each fitted into its frame with tar and resin. The glass in several bulged as though water pressed against it from inside. One cabin held a pile of lard candles, neatly wrapped in cloth, unburned. Another had a bed woven entirely from roots braided so tightly they looked like rope. A third held a chair with a hollow seat. Inside, a compartment of split twigs, each carved to a point. Nothing decayed here. Nothing was cared for either. The cabins were used, yet never lived in, and always at the back a single locked door, same size, same shape, reinforced from the inside with overlapping boards. Before we open one of those rear doors, I want to ask you something. If you were standing there, hand on the latch with the others watching, would you pull it open to see what was kept inside? Or would you walk away and never speak of this place again? The hinges on those back doors had been filed, flush with the wood, deliberately, meticulously, so no crowbar could catch, no blade could wedge inside. One of the men tried prying up a floorboard near a threshold. It wouldn't budge. Nailed from below. The few rear doors they did force open led to small windowless rooms. Most were empty except for fragments of human life scattered like clues. A handful of straw crossed the floor. A doll of sheep's wool with dried berries for eyes. A single boot, its laces sewn shut, and on every door's interior the same strange marks, vertical scratches low to the ground, some shallow, others deep and layered. Grooves carved not in panic, but in habit, as though something had been trying over and over to remember its own shape. When they returned to those same cabins the next day, doors they'd left gaping were closed again. Their footprints outside had been brushed smooth as if wiped away with leaves. The smell had shifted to damp earth now, laced with the sweetness of spoiled fruit or milk left to rot in the sun. At one cabin, the bed sheets had been turned down. None of the men admitted to touching them. No one claimed to see movement. But beside the penciled floor plan in one field notebook, someone had scrawled a question they never voiced aloud. Are we sure they aren't still here? Among the few buildings left standing, the schoolhouse was in unusual condition. Its roof sagged but hadn't split. The door groaned but held. Inside, only one desk remained, shoved against the far wall. The top drawer was swollen shut from damp. When it finally came free, the records were found. 5 ledgers bound in twine pages, stained with mildew but still legible. Each contained only a single line for each child. No birth dates, no parents' names, no grades or lessons, just names. From 1907 to 1933, every child carried the same surname, Whitlock. No exceptions. The handwriting shifted slightly between volumes, different record keepers, but the ink never changed. Oak gall, dark and oily letters bleeding faintly through to the reverse, leaving mirrored ghosts. The given names repeated to Elias: Ruth, Caleb, Thalia, Matthew. Their order varied, but the cycle was exact, repeating every 6 to 7 years. In one case, a name from 1921 had been struck through and replaced with a name from 1914, written in the same ink the original, never used again. The archivist speculated the names weren't chosen, they were assigned. Or worse, transferred. That theory hardened when the photographs surfaced. Tucked inside the third ledger was a stack of thin, faded prints. Groups of children posed outside the same schoolhouse in different years. Their clothes changed. The background weathered. But the faces hardly changed at all. A smile in one year became a blank stare in the next. In some, the differences between decades were no more than a slight shift in eye spacing or jawline, as if someone had recarved a familiar face in fresh clay. This was not ordinary reproduction. This was refinement. The schoolhouse held no chalk, no books, no signs of teaching, only the names. In one ruined cabin nearby, a wall bore 42 carved tally marks, each ending with a cross. On the back of one ledger, a faint water-blurred note read, "When a child dies, we wait. When the name returns, the child walks again." Not remembrance, summoning. The adults of Whitlock's Hollow remained unseen. The children, however, they were spotted in the woods, always at a distance, always still, watching. The first sighting came from a member of the hydrology team who had stepped behind the schoolhouse to relieve himself. He came back, pale, shaking. 3 figures had been standing just inside the tree line, barefoot, unmoving. All the same height, wearing hand-stitched garments without seams or any visible fastening at all. If you were that man stepping back into the clearing with your heart pounding, would you tell the others what you saw, or keep it to yourself, knowing you still had nights left to spend in that place? They stood shoulder to shoulder, heads tilted at the same slight angle, as though listening for a sound that hadn't yet happened. At first, the others brushed off the report as nerves, but the sightings continued. By the end of the second day, 4 different men had caught glimpses of what they called the small ones. Always at the edge of vision, never speaking, never eating. Their posture was strange, neither relaxed nor tense, but poised like they were waiting for a signal that no one else could hear. On the third day, one of them was approached. The child, or the thing that looked like a child, was crouched beside a stump. hands folded neatly in its lap, eyes locked on the intruder. It didn't flee. Not until the man was within 10 feet. Then it bared its teeth. Not in fear, but in silent warning. The gums were dry. The teeth mismatched. Several had been filed. When another man tried to circle behind it, the boy didn't run. He simply dropped flat into the undergrowth so precisely, so suddenly, that the ground seemed to swallow him. Later they found no footprints. Only a patch of pine needles turned in a perfect spiral, as though something had spun in place before vanishing. Worse were the duplicates. On the fourth evening, two surveyors working miles apart both described seeing a child sitting on a fallen log beside the marsh. Without speaking to each other, both sketched the sighting in their field books. The drawings matched exactly the same tilt of the head, the same curve of the spine, the same thin scar from jaw to collarbone. One swore the child had been near the cabins that morning. The other insisted it was a girl, not a boy, and that she had opened her mouth to speak. But no sound had come out. A medical officer suggested inbreeding a closed bloodline, producing uniform features. But that didn't explain why they always appeared in odd numbers, 135, never 2. Nor did it explain the note later found in the margin of a survey map. They don't blink when we do. They're waiting for something, and I think they already know who we are. The map was later discovered folded inside the man's boot. The ink had bled into the leather. Only one word was still legible: returning. The first trapdoor was found by accident, when a surveyor's foot punched through a soft plank at the back of a cabin, beneath a hatch, painted to match the floor, bolted shut from below. The seams sealed with a paste of lime clay and pine straw, packed thick like mortar. When the bolts were cut, the smell rose first. Not rot, but the stale, heavy breath of air that had been trapped for years. The ladder had rotted away, but the shaft descended 7 feet into a cramped earthen chamber. The walls were shored with timber and clay. In the center, 4 rusted iron rings were bolted into the ground. The soil beneath them was hardened, cracked. Frayed rope still clung to one ring, one knot faintly visible. A dark starburst stain spread outward from the center, whether blood or something else no one could say. There were no bones, no remains. And yet, the space didn't feel empty. Every cabin had one. Same construction, same purpose. Some contained thin wooden slats, as if for partitioning. Others had shelves carved directly into the dirt. On those shelves, a child's shoe wrapped in twine, a jar of teeth, a bird's wing pressed flat between 2 panes of glass. No labels, no explanations. One chamber was even lined with animal hides tacked flat against stone walls as though to muffle sound. Imagine standing in one of those chambers, lantern in hand, the air pressing against your skin. What would you do first? Look up or look behind you? They bore no markings, no pigment, but when a lantern was held close, faint outlines emerged, fingerprints, hundreds of them, pressed from the inside out. A medical officer during excavations studied the rings. He said they weren't meant for cages. They were anchors not to hold something dangerous, but to hold something still. 4 points perfectly spaced surrounding a bare patch of earth, like the layout of an examination table. Yet no cabin contained surgical tools, no sign of treatment. What unsettled the team most wasn't what they found, but what had once been there and left no exit. No tunnels, no claw marks, just silence and packed earth. A field journal entry appeared days later, unsigned. We sealed them in to keep them quiet. Not safe, just quiet. Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, unfamiliar to anyone in the crew, was another line. But they do not forget the shape of the room. By the third night in Whitlock's Hollow, the sounds began. At first they thought it was wildlife possums, field mice forest. Life settling after dark, but the noises didn't come from outside. They came from beneath, and they didn't move away when approached. A junior geographer sleeping in one of the larger cabins was the first to speak up. He described a soft rhythmic brushing under the floorboards. Not random, not skittering, a pattern, like fabric dragging across packed soil. When he rose to investigate, the sound stopped. When he lay back down, it resumed, closer, directly beneath his cot. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, 2 others reported similar disturbances. One heard knocking, always in groups of 3. Another swore he heard slow, shallow breathing seeping through the floor cracks, followed by a pause, as if something was listening back. Not all the reports were taken seriously. One man refused to go inside his cabin, sleeping upright on the porch with his boots still on. Another gagged whenever he crossed the threshold, as though the air inside had changed. Then things escalated. A sealed chamber was found beneath one cabin, its mortar still intact. 3 men pried it open. The smell hit them like a wall hot wet with rot and iron. 2 vomited immediately. One man dropped his lantern. Another, a veteran of the field, requested reassignment before nightfall. No reason given. Inside, no bones, no artifacts. Only claw marks, wide arcs scraped across the floor, made by something large, something that worked slowly, persistently. At the center sat a single stone, smooth, flat, warm to the touch despite the cold earth. Beneath it, nothing. Just soft, undisturbed soil. That night, the surveyor who had ordered the chamber opened was found sitting outside. His boots were gone, his socks wet. He said something had knocked from inside the floorboards, not under them, inside the wood. He was discharged the next morning. The note in the log read, "Field fatigue." That same day, part of the clearing sagged inward, a shallow dip 3 feet wide. The soil around it cracked in a perfect ring. Tests showed the ground beneath was hollow, untouched by roots or stone. No one volunteered to dig. A final scrawl appeared in the departure report beside a map of the settlement. We came to measure the land, but the land has already measured us. No one returned for over 2 decades. Yet, reports began surfacing elsewhere in the state. The same sounds, soft brushing, measured breathing, floorboards creaking in perfect rhythm, always at night, always in 3s. If you were there lying in that silence and you heard 3 slow knocks from beneath you, would you answer? They were found in a crate hidden beneath the archives of the Charleston field office. The label read, masonry samples. There was no shipping manifest, no sender, no date of arrival. Inside, wrapped in soft gauze, lay 4 partial skulls. Each belonged to a child no older than 10. The medical examiner felt uneasy, not from rot, for there was none, but from proportion. The skulls were wrong. Wider than they should have been, the eye sockets pitched upward as if made to see from below. One jawbone was missing. The rest had underdeveloped teeth, but the cranial sutures were already beginning to fuse. A strange contradiction. Bones that looked young, yet were biologically old. In the confidential report, a phrase appeared: interrupted maturation. Genomic looping, not standard medical terms. Later, in quiet conversations among only the oldest analysts, it was whispered that looping meant something deliberate. Not the accident of inbreeding, but design, controlled heredity, repeated, generation after generation, each cycle bringing the children closer to a single form. One skull bore a small hole in its crown, not a surgical trephination, but something cruder, as if drilled by hand, then sealed with blackened pine pitch. The examiner wondered if it was meant not to let something in, but to keep something from getting out. An internal memo on Whitlock settlement genetic retention patterns proposed a theory never officially endorsed. Whitlock's hollow may not have seen inbreeding as degeneration, but as refinement. Not the purity of bloodline, but the consistency of outcome. Children chosen not for love, but for resemblance. The same pairings, the same faces. Over decades, they became copies, slightly altered eyes, slightly narrower jaws, the same child born again and again. Time in Whitlock's hollow was not a line. It was a loop. A field surgeon scrawled a question in the margin. If they remove enough variation, can they still be called human? No one answered. In the final drawer of the schoolhouse, they found a small wooden toy, an eyeless animal. Beneath it, a scrap of cloth with a stitched name. It matched the skull fragment stack, and it matched the name of a living child listed in the settlement ledger 7 years after that skull had been buried. The chapel wasn't on any of the original maps. It stood on the edge of the settlement, hidden behind sapling pines and thorn brush. Small, no bell, no cross. The windows were covered in stretched parchment, stained with moisture, painted with symbols in a language no one could place. Beneath its rotting floorboards, in a false joist, they found a scroll stitched into itself with human hair bound in animal hide. Its title, written in heavy ink across the first page, The Return of Flesh. It was no scripture, no parables, no prayers. It read like an instruction manual, cold, clinical. It forbade burial. It warned against fire. It condemned breaking family bonds through death rites. The phrase, "leave the body to soil," appeared again and again, each time followed by the warning that if discarded, the soul would sour and take root beneath the house where it was born. One passage told of the old mistake an ancestor buried beyond the pines, whose cries were later heard through the wood of his children's beds. Another warned that if any limb was taken beyond the boundary, it would rot outward until the whole bloodline failed. A crude diagram followed a figure bound upright in a wooden box with holes for breath and feeding. Beneath it, the caption, "He waits until his name is given again." The doctrine's focus was clear: preserve the pattern. Flesh was not finite, it was repeatable. Kin were to remain together. No sibling buried apart. No parent lowered into foreign ground. The flesh was to be dried, preserved, sealed, kept warm, kept close, kept still. The final stanza spoke of something called the seventh waiting. Poetic, vague. It warned of the moment when the children remember too early and the doors beneath them forget to stay shut. No one knew what it meant. A faint set of fingerprints was pressed into the parchment, not drawn, but real. Human. If you were holding that scroll in your hands right now and felt the warmth of those fingerprints under your fingertips, would you keep reading or put it back? The fingerprints around the final stanza were child-sized, identical. A ring of them pressed into the parchment like a crown. One analyst noted something odd in the title, The Return of Flesh. Not the return to flesh, but flesh itself returning. Not resurrection. Repetition. The scroll remains sealed in climate-controlled storage. But according to its last reader, the hide it was written on had begun to stretch as if it still recognized its own name. One of the earliest anomalies noted by the federal team was the absence of flame. Not just unlit hearths or extinguished lanterns, but an entire settlement without the means to make fire. No chimneys, no stoves, no pots blackened by soot. Even the chapel's beams bore no trace of candle smoke. The only light came from narrow slits cut high in the cabin walls, angled so sharply that only a sliver of sun could enter at midday. It wasn't neglect. It was enforcement. Later in the basements, they found something else. Wooden frames strung with sinew, suspended just above the dirt floors. Some held linen sheets stiff and curled with age. Others carried darker residue, brown mottled, clumped, where it had dried and cracked more than once. Embedded in some of the strands were small white fragments. Human baby teeth. These were not cooking racks, not for drying meat. There was no salt, no brine, no smell of preservation compounds. In one chamber, dozens of fingernail parings arranged in a spiral, hidden between folds of hide. In another, a basket of doll heads, partially melted, eyes gouged, faces identical. No visible fire source. An anthropologist suggested solar preservation, drying without heat using airflow, and humidity control. But the air in Whitlock's Hollow was never dry, and the cabins allowed no breeze. Windows sealed, doors reinforced. Basements closed tight with stone and mortar. The only written reference to fire was scratched into the underside of a drawer in the schoolhouse. 4 words etched with a needle point. Do not wake them. They believed flame could wake something, not destroy it. Beyond the settlement, a team member found a ring of charred stones. Beneath them, in a hollowed log, lay vertebrae, fused by intense heat. The ash was old, 60 years before the federal team arrived. No other fire had been recorded since. Among the investigators, an unspoken question took root. If Whitlock's Hollow forbade burning, what did they fear might rise in the smoke? That night, 2 cabins shifted. No wind, no quake, just wood groaning inward, as if bracing against something beneath the floor that hadn't yet decided to surface. The order to evacuate came on March 28, 1935. It wasn't written in panic. The fieldwork was complete, the findings logged. On paper, the reasoning cited public health and structural decay. But between the lines, there was fear. If you were part of that team standing in a village where no fire had burned for decades, and the walls began to bend inwards without a sound, would you wait to see what came through? The order came from the district office in Columbia. 10 days. That's all the residents of Whitlock's Hollow were given to leave. Notices were printed, hand-delivered by a field agent, nailed to the doors of all 42 structures. No one replied. No one stepped outside. No one even touched the paper. 3 days later, the same agent returned to check. The notices still hung where he'd left them. Inside the cabins, chairs had been turned to face the walls. Beds stripped bare. Dried vines looped across the floors in deliberate repeating shapes like some quiet rite no one had noticed before. And beneath the trapdoors, those sealed hatches that had been closed during the first inspection, there was something new. They were open, not broken, not splintered. The nails and resin seals had been peeled away cleanly, as if softened and lifted by hand. The chambers below were empty of bodies, but each one now bore a single mark at its center, a smudge of wet earth freshly disturbed. Despite no rain, the evacuation was never enforced. When the federal team came back 3 weeks later, Whitlock's Hollow was different. Not just silent vacant. Fires burned in hearths that hadn't existed weeks earlier. A jug of water sat on a sill, beads of condensation still clinging to the glass. A scrap of cloth caught in a doorframe, as if pulled from someone's shoulder moments before they vanished. No tracks, no cards, no trail of belongings. The most unsettling find was at the far marsh where the tree line broke into slow-moving water. The dogs refused to go near it. One whimpered and fled. Another lay flat, unmoving. The men went on alone. Small barefoot prints, recent, ringed the water in concentric circles. They led nowhere. The pool's surface was still reflecting, the trees perfectly. But the sky in the reflection was wrong. In a field sketch, someone scrawled a final note. Several cabins now stood slightly askew, shifted, as if nudged inward, drawn toward an unseen center. No residents were ever found. No further orders were given. But on the fourth morning, a child's voice carried across the water, not calling for help, not speaking, just breathing. By 1942, the war effort demanded timber rail lines and housing. The land was declared structurally sound. Engineers began clearing the marsh's edge. 3 weeks later, the first foundation split cleanly down the center, as if something below had sliced upward. The decades that followed were marked by a quiet, persistent resistance. Posts leaned. Pipes burst. Trees toppled in full-bloom roots, recoiling from something unseen. In 1956, 2 workers vanished during lunch. Their tools remained upright, warm to the touch. A family in the 60s lasted 6 weeks. The father's final unsent letter claimed they couldn't sleep for the breathing that came not from the wind or the trees, but from the soil itself. Later studies found Whitlock's topsoil loose, unfixed. Holes dug at dusk vanished by morning. Flags driven into the ground were found deeper the next day, still standing straight. Locals called it sleeping ground. Not cursed, not haunted, just unwilling. In 2001, a crew laying fiber optic cable reported their tools failing their signals, dying underground. When they stood still, they heard a faint ticking, misaligned like a clock made of bone, counting something that couldn't be seen. No deer graze here. Birds don't circle. At night, along the marsh, footsteps move in pairs, always parallel, always beneath. Some say the hollow is a grave that remembers. Others say it's a waiting room, and that nothing beneath it ever truly died. The last cabin fell in 1978 with no storm, no wind. The ground simply gave way. No one builds here now. No one stays. Those who have walked the tree line speak of a silence that listens, a breath that waits, names whispered by mouths that were never burned. And before you leave this story, a question for you. If you were standing at the marsh's edge, hearing that child's breath drift across still water, what would you do? Wherever you're listening from, whether it's night or day, type your city and the exact time into the comments. Because time matters in stories like this. Sometimes it's the only thing between you and what's been waiting.